And welcome back to Runway Life, the podcast for everyone in aviation. Andrew is back, and
It's almost like we didn't go anywhere.
yeah. So Andrew is a first officer with a major airline that we're not going to mention.
Just for privacy's sake. No,
Yeah,
no
yeah.
real reason. Just not one of those things we talk about.
Yeah, but ultimately, when you say the name of the company, if you say anything that's wrong, then it could be called.
The views expressed in this
into
podcast
question.
do not necessarily represent the views of.
So let's do a few rapid fire questions. These are the warm ups. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
We missed them in the last one, but I did plug them in.
Yes.
Okay. What was your favorite flight?
My solo.
Your solo?
My solo.
Yeah, that one sticks with me every time I fly, actually. It
Yeah.
really does. It's awesome. So, digital or analog?
It depends on the situation.
Okay.
Learning analog.
Yep.
Professional digital.
Yep. And then favorite airport?
Oh man, that's
And that can be
hard.
either general aviation or professional, or you can give both if you would like.
That's a really hard one because I really like Tim Hortons, and Vancouver has a Tim Hortons on the other side of customs, so I can get my Tim bits.
It's sitting there waiting for me.
Yeah. That's. I think I'm gonna go with Vancouver.
Okay.
Vancouver is high on the list right now.
Okay.
No stress, easy in and out. Not usually pretty busy. Usually very quiet. And there's Tim Hortons.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So in this episode, we're going to go ahead and talk about the 250 to 1500, safety through experience. But you do have kind of a footprint for training that we were going to talk about in the last episode. Do you want to?
Yeah, there was we talked last week kind of about my first steps, my initial steps, and I kind of left out some important things I wanted to touch on, which really is training footprint and timeline. And Derek, you're going through this right now, so this will matter to you too. It is very important, and I don't think we sell this enough as instructors or flight schools. It is very important that you fly as regularly as possible. In order to be successful here, you need to be able to dedicate a solid chunk of your time to being in the airport or in the airplane, one of the two, preferably in the airplane. The more you fly, the more consistently you fly. If you can get in 3 flights a day, fly 3 flights a day. Like that's the level of commitment you should be at, because your muscle memory, your comprehension, the retention of skill is so much greater, right? When you're in that airplane on a regular basis, so much greater.
Yep.
And so I think I kind of mentioned it that I took like 2 weeks off. I paid out my vacation and I took all my sick time to be here for 2 weeks, and that was why. Getting to that 250 hours, getting through your certificates. When you're up for a certificate, you should be in the airplane every single day.
Right. No, I totally agree. I did the same thing. If I remember correctly, I took 3 days off right before my jet ride and just flew. But I'd already been flying very, very regularly leading up to that. So
yeah, and I also want to follow that up by saying I was also one of those people who said the people who say that are stupid. Right? Like I was one of the people who said that I can't do that. That doesn't apply to me. They don't understand my situation. I was that guy.
Yep.
I was that guy where everyone telling me that you should be dedicating so much of your time. They didn't know me. They didn't know my life. They didn't know my situation, and they were generalizing. And they turns out I was wrong.
Surprise. I would say that's also a big part of the pilot adventure or track, if you would, is knowing when you're wrong, right?
Yeah,
and being able to say, oh, yep,
I was wrong about that.
That was me.
You want to be here as every single day. You want to don't sell a kidney because you'll need your medical, but you want to be here every single day.
Yeah.
If you can be in the airplane every single day, it is that important, and it will help you. And the reason being is like it will make the calendar days in which you actually work on this. It will take the calendar time and make it so much shorter.
Yep.
It is possible to get a private pilot certificate in a week and a half.
Yep.
You just have to fly 3 times a day and come in with your written finished. And if you can do that, there's no reason why you can't. if you can do that, you will have your private pilot certificate in 40 to 45 hours in a week and a half.
When Derek blew through it, how long was yours again?
30 days.
30 days. He blew through his private in 30 days. Instrument, commercial, I mean, started in October last year, and he's already at commercial and CFI in training by, October, without going crazy, right? But having a direct approach to it and a deliberate approach to it. Right. So that's an important one. So let's roll into. Oh, actually, I do have one more question.
I have one more answer.
Are you a big fan of people that choose to buy their own plane to try to keep down on the costs and have that option to fly as much as possible? Or
yeah, so that's a great question. In that it yes, if you can afford to buy your own airplane, you should buy your own airplane. But understand that there very often are hidden risks and hidden costs.
Yep.
So you can buy your own airplane and take that forward as a way for training, right? That's totally doable, totally plausible.
Right.
But there are a lot of risks in what you're going to find under the hood. So getting a solid pre-buy done, knowing that the engine has good time, that there's no ADs outstanding, no airworthiness directives outstanding on the airplane's like paramount. When you rent, that's all on the school you're renting from.
Yep.
Right? That's the responsibility of somebody else, and you're paying for them to accept that risk. So if you have money in the bank and you're willing to accept the risk, I totally think the math works out to buy an airplane to train. But for a lot of people, myself included, I was not able to accept the risk. If something would have gone wrong and I wound up with a lemon, I was not in a position where I could accept the loss on a broken airplane.
Yep. I think, and that delta is like flying at 100 hours a year or having some sort of an option for lease backs and that kind of stuff. But understand, if you go in the lease back, now it is your plane still, but it's not really your plane, and availability starts to fall into there. So there's always, I think it's all the way through life, there's pluses and minuses to every decision. So just be careful which one you make. So 250 to 1500. This
250
is
to 1500.
This is a path that you have relatively recently taken. Within the last 5 years, you've taken it. So
no, I've been at the
6
airlines
years.
for 7.
7. Okay, yeah. So,
Coming up on 7.
but you're the most recent person that I know that has really made it. Rubber stamp. So talk to us about it.
I had 1,500 hours when I started at PSA. Actually, I had 1,475.
Okay.
I had 1,475 hours when I started at PSA because 25 hours of your 50-hour multi-engine requirement can be done in the sim.
Okay.
And since your training footprint requires a minimum of 25 hours for the type certificate, there you go. So they'll hire you at 1,475. I remember my very first flight in the jet. Like it was yesterday. We took off out of Charlotte and we landed in Gulfport, Mississippi, and I was still in Charlotte. I had no idea what just happened. The 1,500-hour rule came about after the Colgan accident of 2009 as a way to make sure that we as pilots have solid experience behind us. We got into this position where there really was no real-world experience. You got to 250 hours in the classroom, and then if you were lucky and you shook the right hands and you applied at the right time and the market and the environment was just right, you could go to a regional airline and fly fare-paying passengers with 250 hours of time and no real-world experience.
Right.
And that is how several other nations in the world do it. And it is absolutely silly that we allow that to happen in those places. It's absolutely silly that we allowed it to happen here. The workload, the amount of work that occurs up front is very busy in the beginning of the flight, very slow during the middle of the flight, and very busy at the end of the flight. Unless something goes wrong.
Right.
And then it's very busy the whole time. And that something that goes wrong can be something. It's very often for us, it's not something with the airplane. The plane doesn't break very often. The passengers break, right? And that is a whole other set of complications, because the moment I have a sick passenger in the back, the moment the captain and I look at each other and we determine that we have to get the ground-based doctors that we use involved, one person has left the flight deck, right?
Yeah.
He's sitting there, but he's on the radio with somebody on the ground, and I am now responsible for talking to air traffic control, flying the airplane, looking for an alternate airport if we have to go to one, doing the calculations for fuel, figuring out the weather. All of these things now fall to me because he is busy working with the other passenger, or working with the flight attendants on the passenger and talking to the doctor, trying to relay information. And this is important because that doctor is going to tell us if we need to continue, if we need to divert. And if we need to divert, they might tell us that we need to go to a specific city because the condition the passenger's in might necessitate traveling to a city that has a specific care unit for the kind of condition that that doctor believes the passenger's currently in.
Talk
All that
about
to say,
workload saturation.
yeah, all that to say very quickly, and it happens to me probably once a month. Very quickly, we wind up in a scenario where it is a task-saturated environment, and I am flying the airplane alone, and I am doing a lot of tasks alone on the airplane. Sometimes those scenarios are more stressful than others. Sometimes there's more workload involved than others. But I'm saying all this to say that 1,500 hours, yeah, I flew as a CFI, and I did a lot of pattern work, and I did a lot of just generalized navigation. I did a lot of general low altitude, upper altitude. I did the basic maneuvers with students all the time.
Right.
I got really good at working in a crewed environment because I, in that scenario, was acting as the captain. Specifically, as my students got more competent and they got closer to their check ride, I would be the one supervising. I'd be the pilot monitoring more and the pilot flying less. So I had a lot of experience in that kind of division of power, right?
Right.
I was the ultimate sole authority responsible for the safety of the flight, just like the captain is on any commercial flight you take. But as my students progressed, they got more and more responsibility in ensuring that what they were doing was safe and competent. 250 hours, you have none of that.
Right.
You have none of that. So it's an incredibly important rule that gets talked about a lot. But as a real world airline pilot, it is there for safety. It is there because that experience is tantamount to the safety record we've had in the U.S. since.
I mean, to think that anybody would be able to go to the airlines at 250 hours, right? That means, I mean, I'm sitting at about 195, 200 hours. I mean, Derek's, 260, 275. To think that you would now be, okay, you've gone through your private, you've gone through your instrument, now you've gone through your commercial, and you're actually being hired to go off and go and do airlines is absolutely mind-blowing to me. To think that could happen. So now the 1,500-hour rule has always really, in its basic form made sense to me. We might not like it, right? Because it's now a goal that we have to get to. But it is there for a reason, and it's a very good reason.
Well, and I'll follow that up with, not to harp on a dead horse, I fly the 737.
Right.
I fly the MAX. It's there. Multiple domestic U.S. airlines experienced MCAS runaways.
Mm-hmm.
None of the domestic U.S. airlines experienced fatal crashes, right? And that's not to say that Lion Air and Ethiopian didn't have well-trained crews, but their minimum experience requirements were different than what we have here in the U.S.
Yep.
There was nobody in a 737 in the U.S. who had just hopped out of a Navajo or a Duchess and straight into a 737. And the training requirements in the U.S. are such that like the captain and the first officer are qualified to the same extent. Like we're competent, we're rated to fly the same airplane. I can fly a 737 with the same level of proficiency as my captain can. The difference is I'm not legally responsible for the flight, right? There's a legal authority that I don't have, and that's fine. I don't want that. That somebody else can have that. I'll get it one day. Don't need it now. But I can't fathom having just come out of general aviation and having been sat down in a Q400
Yep.
and flying through icing conditions that I've never seen before and all of a sudden we wind up in a low airspeed event, and a lot of that was experience and training. A lot of that was just not having enough stall recovery at altitude. A lot of that was just not going through recurrent at 135s, right? Because a lot of this experience that we get as CFIs is equivalent to the experience you'll get as a pilot at a 135.
Right.
As you go through their training footprints and as you go through their recurrence as well.
Right. So during your 250 to 1500, can you think of, a situation that you saw that has really helped you when you did transition over to being in the airlines, or some sort of some
Yeah.
event that happened that has really helped you when you moved on?
This is something that I think a lot of airline pilots still struggle with to this day, because we're very mission oriented, we're goal oriented,
Yeah.
right? We there are a few airline pilots I know that play the game and that will look for the out in their rules, and they do. But by and large, most of us want to get the job done, and we want to get our passengers safely to their destination. But being able to say no.
Right.
There were several times where students had check rides coming up, where students were coming up to the end of that 2-week period I was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
The weather was bad. The plane was misbehaving. Personal minimums. Developing your personal minimums in those 1,500 hours, because they change, they progress, they go up a little, they come back some. Maybe you feel more comfortable doing something one day, and then you realize a couple weeks later that you shouldn't really be that comfortable.
Right.
All of that is incredibly important, right? And ultimately, when I got to PSA, I wound up looking back on that experience. There was an event at PSA where I had to go back to my personal minimums, and I had to talk to my chief pilot and say, the plane is airworthy, the flight plan is legal. I am not safe performing this operation. I am not comfortable performing this flight, because all of the pieces that you've provided me are here. But from my experience, these kind of dominoes line up and stack up.
Yep.
And I don't want to be there when they fall down.
Well, that's part of, I would say that's, your personal minimums, and always staying inside of I'm safe, right? Personal minimums, I'm safe, the two, and I think I did the pyramid once before in another episode. But that's judgment comes into there too, which now turns it into a square, I believe. But
Which at 1,500 hours, or sorry, at 250 hours, you don't have.
no,
It's just not there. And there is an argument that the airlines are going to train you how they want you to be trained. There is an argument that the actual day-to-day operations of GA are incredibly different from the actual day-to-day operations of an airline. Those two things are 100% true, and they are 100% invalid arguments to why we should not have 1,500 hours.
right,
Because the 1,500 hours is not about developing airmanship alone. The
Right.
1,500 hours is about developing airmanship and about developing you as a professional aviator
Right.
and your sense of limits, boundaries, and experience.
No, it's, again, judgment. You need to be able to say, this is too much for me. This, at this precise moment, at this time in my life, my career, my training, my progression, it is too much for me. But with that comes a lot of responsibility, right?
Right.
Being able to say, this is not what I should be doing. So I think that comes with time, age, and experience. So,
Absolutely.
So once you obviously 250 hours, you moved on. Did you do your multi-engine instructor as well, or did you just do multi-engine?
I just did the multi.
Okay.
By the time I was in that position, at that time in my life, there was no reason for multi-engine. For
Well,
anything.
let's
I have the
just-
add-on now, but I didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was just like yeah.
go ahead and just what ratings do you have now?
Oh, I'm CFI II MEI, and then I'm all the way through CL. I have a CL65 type rating, and I have a 737 type rating.
Did you do the CRJ? Okay,
Yeah,
yep.
CL65. Yeah.
Okay, so
CRJ.
okay,
Sorry.
yeah.
Sorry, CRJ, CL65. Yeah.
So out of those ratings, which would you say was the hardest one of those? We're going to leave instrument out because we did instrument on the last one. I just want to see if we can zero in on which one was the harder of the ratings.
My CFI initial was particularly hard.
Okay.
And that I say that because that's a weird one. I was already a CFI. I was a poor CFI.
Right.
But there was this is where back when FSDO, the Flight Standards District Office, assigned you a DPE for your CFI initial. I was
Right.
already a CFI, but they were still counting it as an initial because they didn't consider the sport pilot CFI a CFI.
Has that changed now?
Yeah, so now the FSDO
Okay.
doesn't assign you. Now you
Okay.
can just use anybody, but that's because the DPE shortage has gotten so bad they physically can't manage. They don't want to be responsible for you not having a check ride for 2 months.
And I want to touch on that for 1 second. I actually read an interesting little blurb recently from a local, very well known DPE, Kyle. It was on a Facebook group, but he'd said, try to stop your instructors from putting you in for the reason why the DPE shortage really exists is that the FAA allows more DPEs to come in when they see that there is a shortage. However, when students are being put in, submitted for their check ride, 3 days before the check ride is actually happening, because it's been booked for 3 months, it creates it looks like there's no issues.
I'd make the rebuttal that for some instances you don't necessarily qualify for the application until 3 days prior. So that's a double-edged sword.
And I would agree.
Yeah, because I can sign your application. We can start the application 3 months prior to your check ride. We can start the application when you start pilot training, but that's not a legal application.
No. But it does look to the FAA on their side that, well, this person put in, for the check ride 3 days before, and now they're actually sitting it within 3 days of the application. So it kind of creates false data for them to try to follow, which doesn't allow them to open up the books to make more DPEs, because that's what they solely rely on. And this, again, is not my opinion. This is down to Kyle, which I mean, he goes out on Facebook, so I don't think it's going to be a big issue for me to reference that.
Yeah, and I'm sure he's referencing a conversation FSDO has had with the DPEs. I would argue that the FAA is using the wrong set of tools because they know when your student pilot certificate was issued. So they can see from the date your student pilot certificate was issued to when you make the application, and they know how many students applied for a student pilot application, and they know how many student pilots signed an application.
Yep.
They should be looking at the student pilot certificate issuance date. That's my opinion.
So FAA, please listen to Andrew Barton,
and
let's fix that problem for everybody in aviation.
Yeah.
So let's go back to that initial question.
Yeah.
Which would you say was really the hardest one?
CFI. This is an experience I've had a couple of times over my professional aviation career. My CFI initial DPE was very challenging.
Okay.
He is a very smart person.
Okay.
And so is my instrument DPE. When I did my instrument, she was incredibly smart. And the problem is, the smarter the DPE is, the more they have to teach, but they can't teach.
Right.
Right? So they can't teach in a check ride. They know a lot.
Right.
But to them, if you're not hitting some of these things that they know that might be fringe topics that still fall within the confines of the ACS, so a good example is I got kind of drilled for almost half an hour during my CFI initial on how a VOR operates. Like the actual functions of the VOR, the carrier signal, the child signal, the difference between an analog and the new digital VORs that we have. I'm a pilot,
Yeah.
I just kind of need to know how to tune and find a radial.
Yeah.
That's kind of like, I'm not a radio systems operator. I'm not a radio systems engineer. I just need to know how to use the thing to find where I am.
Well, that's kind of like finding the rabbit hole and going right down it, right? You don't need to
Yeah.
go down the rabbit hole to know that there is a rabbit hole there.
The problem is, the smarter the DPE, the more rabbit holes they have
So-
to pull you down.
Well, and that's,
Yeah.
that is also, I think that's a piece of advice that I would give to anybody for check rides.
I'm not saying
Say what you need to say.
Yeah, I'm not saying find a stupid DPE.
Yeah.
And
No.
I'm not trying to say that at all. He was very smart and he had a lot of knowledge to give, and you could tell he wanted to. He just couldn't do it during the check ride, and that made the CFI ride very difficult for me.
Right. So, be careful what it is that you do say in check rides. I think that's a good piece of advice for anybody. Speak to answer the question that you have been asked.
Concise answers.
Concise answers. If you go down a rabbit hole, the DPE will absolutely follow you and let you keep on talking, and that could run you into a big problem.
They will tear you up.
Andrew, we're going to close out this episode. Thank you very much. Is there anything else that you had to add for this episode? This one's the 250 to 1500, so
Yeah.
words of wisdom.
The only other thing I'll say is there's a lot of ways to build time. I did want to touch on this a little bit. There are a lot of ways to build time, be it 135 operator, be it 91K, be it buying a plane and time building. There is no wrong answer in reality. There's no wrong answer in how you build time. What I will say is being a CFI is not for everybody, but being a CFI for me taught me a lot. I'm still a CFI. I still actively teach when I have time and when I can. I'm still a coach for people looking to come to my airline in our career pathway program. I've got 6 students in that program. Don't discount being a CFI. If you want to go 135, there's tons of great operators out there and great options, and they will teach you a lot about the crewed environment and operating a jet and turbine time. But don't discount being a CFI.
Yeah.
I learned more from that than anything else.
I would like to add one thing to that. We did the analog or digital.
Yes.
Get a taste of some sort of digital inside of that 1,500 hours, please. That would probably make your transition over to the simulators significantly easier. I have been blessed in one or many, many different times in life, but one instance for aviation where I have a very good friend of mine that works for a big simulator training company, and he allowed me to spend some time in the G650 sim.
Nice.
And I will tell you this, if I would have jumped straight out the Cherokee to go do that, that would have been fire hose, not just drinking from it. It probably would have been just severing my head. But when it because I spent so many hours in the SR-22, it actually was a little bit easier for me to understand.
Yeah.
Probably the hardest part of that was actually turning it on.
Yeah.
Firing up the APU, firing up the engines was actually the harder part. And judging off of that and what I've heard a lot of other people say, it's actually a whole lot easier to fly some of those bigger planes. I'm not getting into Boeings, but I would say for me, experience-wise, I spent time in one of the other simulators over there, and if that's anything like real life.
What was the other simulator?
It was a older TBM.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
to see those two differences, I was like, this plane does actually seem easier to fly.
Yeah.
But we'll get into that next, because obviously the next episode, I really want to talk about 1,500 hours plus, the first day at the airlines and type ratings.
And I can promise you our outfits are not going to change between the next episode and now.
Yes, time constraints. They are real. And we'll work on that. Thank you very much, Andrew. I appreciate it. Take care and stay safe.